The broom struck my shoulder with a sharp crack. "Out!" my son roared, shoving me toward the door. I stumbled, clutching the frame as the suitcase he had hurled split open, my clothes scattering across the floor. The wind howled through the doorway, snow swirling like knives against my face. He slammed the door behind me, the sound echoing like a final judgment. My heart pounded. How had love turned to this? Why was I left to wander the frozen night, cast aside by the very child I had raised? And what awaited me in that merciless storm? If you want to know what happens next, stay with me until the end of the video. And if you still believe deep in your heart that God is always watching over you, silently arranging everything, then right now, leave a comment saying Amen below this video. Because who knows, at the very moment you write those words, a blessing may quietly enter your life. My name is Margaret Hayes, and I never thought I would see the day when the warmth of a home would be taken from me by the very hands I raised. Buffalo winters are no stranger to me. I have lived through 70 of them, each one reminding me how unforgiving the snow can be, how the wind cuts sharper than any knife. But this winter of 2025 has been the coldest of my life, not because of the weather, but because of the way my son looked at me the night he told me to leave. I was born in a small town outside Rochester, the daughter of a factory worker and a seamstress. My parents never had much, but they gave me something greater than money: a sense of family, a belief that love endures storms. I carried those lessons with me when I married young and later became a mother. My husband passed away almost 15 years ago, and since then my life has revolved around my only son, Daniel. I never remarried. I never wanted more. All I ever asked for was to see Daniel safe, to know he had a roof over his head and a family to call his own. When I moved into Daniel's house a few years back, I told myself it was temporary. He had just married Lauren, and money was tight. I had a small pension, enough to cover groceries and a bit toward the bills, and I thought my hands could be useful cooking, babysitting if they ever had children, keeping the laundry folded. I thought I was helping. I thought I was still needed. But sometimes, what we see as help, others see as a burden. It started small, with little sighs when I left the light on, or when I asked Daniel if he wanted a second helping of dinner. Lauren would say things under her breath, words like extra expense or dead weight. I pretended not to hear. Pride can make you blind. I kept telling myself she was young, stressed, that she would grow to see me differently. Daniel, on the other hand, was quieter. He worked long hours at the auto shop, and when the shop cut back his hours, his shoulders sank lower every evening. I could see the lines on his forehead deepen, the way his hands shook when he opened the bills. I wanted to help, but my savings were gone faster than I expected. Groceries cost nearly double what they used to. Heating bills were a nightmare in Buffalo's January wind. I even sold my wedding ring last year, quietly, to help cover a medical bill for Lauren when she had pneumonia. I didn't tell her, didn't tell Daniel either. Maybe that was my mistake. Silence can sometimes look like selfishness. The night it all came to a breaking point is carved into my memory, as clear as the ice on the sidewalk. The snow had been falling since morning, piling up against the porch. The furnace was rattling, working overtime. Lauren and Daniel were arguing in the kitchen about money, their voices sharp enough to slice through the thin walls. I stayed in my room, knitting, telling myself it would pass. But then Daniel's voice rose, and I heard my name. "She could help more if she wanted to," Lauren hissed. "She's just sitting there, pretending she's some saint. I'm not going to keep paying for your mother to live here while we're drowning." The words stung, even from the other side of the door. A moment later, Daniel stormed into my room. His face was red, his eyes tired and angry all at once. He looked at me as though I were the reason for every overdue bill, every sleepless night. "Mom," he said, his voice shaking, "you can't stay here anymore. We can't afford it. You need to go." I froze. I thought I had misheard him. Leave? In the middle of a storm? After everything? I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. All I could do was stare at him, at the broom he was holding like a weapon, though I knew he didn't mean to hurt me. He just wanted me gone. I gathered a few things, a coat, a scarf, an old leather bag with some clothes. My hands trembled as I tied the laces of my boots. I kept hoping he would stop me, that he would change his mind, that the boy I raised would see his mother, and remember the nights I stayed up when he was sick. The mornings I walked him to school in shoes with holes so he could have the newer pair. But he didn't. He stood by the door, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed anywhere but on me. When I stepped outside, the wind nearly knocked me over. Snowflakes stung my face, and the air felt like shards of glass in my lungs. I looked back once, just once, and saw the door close behind me. The porch light flickered off. That was the moment I realized I no longer had a home. The snow swallowed me whole that night. I remember clutching my old leather bag against my chest, as though it could shield me from the wind. The streets of Buffalo were empty, save for the hum of plows pushing snowbanks higher than my shoulders. Every step felt like wading through quicksand made of ice. I had nowhere to go, no plan, no destination. Only the bitter taste of betrayal lingered on my tongue, heavier than the storm itself. At first, I told myself I would walk a little while, find a church, maybe even a shelter. I had heard of them before, places that offered a warm bed for the night, but I had never needed one. Pride had always kept me from asking for help. After all, I had raised a son on my own, worked 2 jobs when I was younger, stitched clothes late into the night to pay for Daniel's school supplies. I thought of myself as strong, capable, too stubborn to admit weakness. But that night, the truth settled in like frost on my skin. I was just an old woman, cast aside into the dark. My boots were thin, the soles worn from years of use. Snow seeped in quickly, numbing my toes until I could no longer feel them. The scarf I wrapped around my head was damp within an hour, the cold air biting through to my bones. Streetlights blurred in the distance, halos of pale gold against the endless white. Each time a car passed, I turned away, ashamed, afraid they might see me wandering like a ghost. I tried to remember the last time I had truly felt at home. Maybe it was years ago, in the little house Daniel grew up in, with the creaky floors and the smell of apple pie in the oven. I used to hum while I cooked, and he would run through the kitchen, his laughter filling the walls. I gave that house up when my husband died. The mortgage was too much for me alone, so I sold it and moved into a smaller apartment. Later, when Daniel asked me to come live with him, I thought it was fate bringing us back together. I never imagined it would end like this. My footsteps erased by the storm before I even knew where I was going. Hours passed. My body ached, my fingers stiff and useless. I knocked on the door of a small corner store, hoping someone might let me stand inside for warmth, but the place was dark, closed for the night. I pressed my forehead against the glass and left a faint smudge before moving on. It was close to midnight when I stumbled into a narrow alley to rest. The wind was calmer there, but the cold was merciless. I sank down on an old wooden crate, my breath fogging the air in short, ragged bursts. My bag slid from my lap, spilling its contents, a change of clothes, a few photographs, a Bible so worn the pages curled at the edges. I picked up the pictures first Daniel as a boy, missing his front teeth, standing proudly with a baseball bat too heavy for his small hands. Another of my husband, his arm wrapped around me, both of us young and certain that love would be enough. I clutched them to my chest and wept quietly, not for myself, but for the family that had crumbled into silence. The next morning, I woke to the sound of footsteps crunching through snow. A man in a heavy coat walked past, glancing at me only briefly before lowering his head and moving on. I wanted to call out, to ask for help, but my throat was raw, my pride louder than my desperation. So I stayed quiet, shrinking deeper into the shadows. By the second day, hunger gnawed at me like a wild animal. My stomach growled so loudly I feared it might echo off the brick walls. I hadn't eaten since leaving Daniel's house. The snow made it impossible to search through trash bins, and the thought of begging on the streets twisted my insides. Still, survival has a way of silencing shame. By the afternoon, I found myself standing outside a small diner, the kind with neon lights buzzing faintly and the smell of fried bacon drifting through the vents. My legs shook as I reached for the door, but I hesitated. What if they threw me out? What if they laughed? Before I could decide, the door opened, and a woman stepped out, brushing snow from her apron. She was in her late 50s, with kind eyes that studied me carefully. Her name, I later learned, was Clara Johnson. "Ma'am," she said softly, her breath fogging in the air. "You look frozen. Come inside, warm up." I wanted to refuse, to pretend I was fine, but the cold had stripped me of any illusions of pride. I nodded, and she guided me in. The warmth hit me like a wave, so sudden I nearly collapsed. She led me to a booth near the window and placed a steaming cup of coffee in front of me. "On the house," she said, her smile gentle but firm, as though daring me to argue. The first sip burned my tongue, but I didn't care. Tears blurred my vision as the heat spread through me. Clara didn't press me for answers right away. Instead, she moved around the diner, serving the handful of customers inside, all while keeping an eye on me. When the rush settled, she slid into the booth across from me. "You don't have to tell me everything," she said, "but I can see you're in trouble. Nobody should be out there in this weather." Her kindness broke the dam I had been holding back. Words spilled out how I had been living with my son, how the fights grew worse, how I was pushed out into the snow with nowhere to go. Clara listened, her hands folded neatly on the table, her eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, she reached across and placed her hand over mine. "You're not alone anymore," she said. "As long as I'm here, you'll have somewhere warm to sit, something hot to eat, and tomorrow we'll figure out what's next." The relief that washed over me was almost too much to bear. For the first time in days, I felt seen, felt human again. That night, Clara let me sleep in a booth after the diner closed. She gave me a blanket, thin but warm, and whispered goodnight as if we were old friends. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but for the first time since Daniel closed the door on me, I felt the faintest glimmer of hope. I woke up the next morning to the smell of coffee brewing and the low hum of a radio in the corner of the diner. My blanket had slipped to the floor during the night, and my joints ached from sleeping in a booth, but I felt more rested than I had in days. Clara moved gracefully behind the counter, her back turned as she flipped pancakes on the griddle. When she noticed I was awake, she smiled and slid a plate toward me. "Eat," she said simply, and I did. I never thought pancakes could make me cry, but as I cut into the stack, my hands trembled. It wasn't just the food, it was the kindness, the reminder that I was still worth caring for. Clara didn't ask for payment, though I offered. All I had left in my bag were a few coins, not enough to buy even a cup of coffee. She shook her head firmly. "You don't owe me anything, Margaret," she said after I told her my name. "But you need to understand something. People will talk. This city is small in its own way. Word spreads fast." I didn't fully grasp what she meant until later that day. The diner sat on a busy corner where buses stopped every 20 minutes, bringing in customers and chatter from all over the neighborhood. By noon, whispers began to circle. I could feel it in the way some customers glanced at me, quick looks that carried curiosity, pity, sometimes judgment. A young waitress leaned close to Clara when she thought I wasn't listening. "Is that the woman who got thrown out by her own son?" she whispered. Clara hushed her, but the words lodged in my chest like a shard of ice. By the end of the week, it seemed everyone in the area knew. A story like mine doesn't stay hidden. Some details twisted along the way. Some said I had refused to pay rent. Others claimed I was impossible to live with. That's the thing about gossip. It grows legs, running faster than the truth. One afternoon, as I sat by the window of the diner sipping coffee, a tall woman with snow-white hair pushed through the door. She carried herself with the kind of dignity that comes from a long life lived with purpose. She ordered tea, then, instead of sitting alone, she walked straight to my table. "You must be Margaret Hayes," she said. I nodded, wary. "My name is Eleanor Brooks. I live just 2 blocks away." She placed her cup down and studied me with sharp but not unkind eyes. "I've heard what happened, and before you worry, I didn't come to judge. I came because I know how it feels." Her words disarmed me. She told me she had been widowed for over 20 years, living alone ever since. Her children had moved out of state and rarely visited. "Loneliness," she said, "is its own kind of cold, sometimes colder than any buffalo winter." For the first time, I didn't feel like a spectacle. I felt like someone understood. We talked for over an hour, about our lives, our mistakes, the things we had sacrificed for our children. Eleanor's voice carried a firmness, as if she had long ago stopped caring what the world thought. Before she left, she pressed a small card into my hand. "There's a church on Elmwood Avenue," she said. "Pastor Michael Reed. He runs community programs. If you're serious about getting back on your feet, he's the man to see." That night, as the diner closed and I curled beneath my blanket, I thought about her words. I had always prided myself on being self-reliant, but what had that pride given me? A son who saw me as a burden, and a body that could barely endure the cold. Maybe it was time to accept help, even from strangers. The next day, Clara walked me to the church. Snow crunched beneath our boots, the wind tugging at our coats. The building rose tall and brick red against the gray sky, its steeple capped with fresh snow. Inside, warmth and the faint smell of pine filled the air. A small group of volunteers moved about, setting up tables with bread and soup for anyone who needed it. Pastor Reed was younger than I expected, maybe in his early 50s, with kind eyes and a voice that carried both strength and gentleness. Clara introduced us, and he extended his hand. "Margaret, you're welcome here," he said. "You have nothing to prove. Everyone deserves shelter, dignity, and compassion." I wanted to believe him. Still, shame lingered. I lowered my eyes as I told him a shortened version of my story, leaving out the broom, the sting of Daniel's words. But Pastor Reed had a way of hearing the silence between sentences. He didn't press, just nodded thoughtfully. "We have connections with housing services," he said. "There are waiting lists, of course, but we'll see what can be done. In the meantime, you'll have meals here, warmth, and people who care." Tears welled in my eyes. I hadn't expected such generosity, not after the way I'd been discarded. I whispered, "Thank you," my voice shaking. Word continued to spread through the community. Some faces I recognized from the old neighborhood stopped by the diner or the church, their eyes filled with pity or awkwardness. But there were others like Eleanor, like Clara, who offered genuine support. One evening, Eleanor even brought me a wool hat she had knitted herself. "It's not much," she said, "but buffalo winters don't forgive bare ears." Meanwhile, Daniel's name came up often. People wondered aloud how a son could send his mother out into the snow. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others muttered that times were hard and maybe I had been difficult. I stayed quiet, unwilling to fuel the fire. Deep down, I still wanted to protect my son, even from gossip. But gossip has a way of finding its mark. One Sunday afternoon, as I sat in the church hall after service, I saw him. Daniel stood at the back of the room, his shoulders hunched, his face pale. He didn't step forward, didn't call my name. He just watched, as though seeing me there, among the community, unsettled something inside him. I couldn't bring myself to speak to him. My heart pounded, torn between longing and anger. When I blinked, he was gone, leaving me with more questions than answers. That night, I lay awake on a cot in the church's shelter room, listening to the hum of the heating system. I thought of Daniel's eyes, tired, guilty, but still the same eyes I had once kissed goodnight after stories and lullabies. Was there hope for us still? Or had the storm buried it forever? Buffalo storms have a way of testing even the strongest of souls. By the end of January, the snow no longer fell in gentle flurries but in heavy sheets, blanketing streets, swallowing cars, and pressing against doors like an uninvited intruder. I had grown used to the chill in my bones. But even the toughest coat cannot stand forever against the kind of cold that sneaks into your very blood. The church shelter had been a blessing, yet it wasn't permanent. Beds were limited, and some nights I gave up my spot for women younger than me, mothers with children clinging to their coats. I would tell Pastor Reed I was fine, that I could manage, and he never argued, though I caught the worry in his eyes. Pride again, always my greatest weakness. I thought I could endure, but endurance has limits. One evening, after leaving the church, I decided to walk a little, just to clear my head. The streets were strangely quiet, muffled under the snow. My boots crunched with every step, and the wind clawed at my scarf. I told myself I'd head back soon, but my legs carried me farther than I intended. Memories guided me down familiar blocks, past the old school Daniel once attended, past the park where we had tossed baseballs until dusk. By the time I realized how far I had gone, the storm had thickened. Snow whipped across my face, blinding me. My breath came in sharp gasps, burning my lungs. I tried to turn back, but the wind shoved against me like an angry hand. Each step grew heavier, my legs trembling as though I carried the weight of every sorrow I had ever known. I stumbled near a corner where the streetlight flickered weakly. My bag slipped from my shoulder, spilling its contents into the snow photographs, my Bible, the little hat Eleanor had knitted. I fell to my knees, fumbling to gather them, but my fingers were numb, clumsy. The pictures smeared with wet flakes, Daniel's boyish grin dissolving before my eyes. That was when my strength gave out. The world tilted, the ground rushing up, and I collapsed into the drift. The cold embraced me with a strange gentleness, as if whispering that I could rest now, that I didn't have to fight anymore. My eyelids grew heavy, and I thought, perhaps this is how it ends quietly, in the very city where I had built my life. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. I faintly heard voices muffled, urgent. A beam of light cut through the snow, and then hands lifted me, strong but careful. Someone wrapped a blanket around me, another pressed something warm against my face. I wanted to open my eyes, but they felt sealed shut. Still, I caught fragments. She's freezing. Get her to the truck now. End of teen. Call Pastor Reed. When I awoke, I was lying in a cot, a soft quilt tucked under my chin. The air smelled faintly of soup and disinfectant. Above me, a wooden cross hung on the wall. The church. I wasn't dead after all. Clara's face hovered into view, worry etching deep lines across her forehead. Margaret, thank God, she whispered. We almost lost you out there. Eleanor was beside her, her hand clutching mine tightly. You gave us quite a scare, she said, her voice shaking though she tried to sound firm. Don't you dare do that again. Pastor Reed entered then, his expression grave but relieved. You were found just in time. Another hour in that storm, and... He didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. Tears slid down my cheeks. I didn't mean to. I just wanted some air. You don't have to explain, Clara said gently. What matters is you're safe now. News of my collapse traveled quickly. By the next day, neighbors who had barely looked at me before began stopping by the church. Some brought food, others blankets. A few offered awkward apologies for not stepping in sooner. I accepted it all with gratitude, though a part of me wondered why it always takes near death for people to notice the suffering right in front of them. What struck me most was the silence from Daniel. I had seen him once before at the church, his eyes shadowed with guilt, but now, when word must have reached him, he stayed away. Perhaps shame held him back. Perhaps denial. Whatever the reason, his absence carved deeper wounds than the storm had. One evening, Eleanor sat with me, knitting by the side of my cot. He'll come, she said suddenly, as though reading my thoughts. Children make mistakes, sometimes terrible ones, but guilt has a way of clawing at the soul until it demands to be faced. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think that somewhere inside Daniel still lived the boy who used to bring me dandelions in spring, his pockets full of treasures only a child could find. But faith, like warmth, felt fragile these days. Pastor Reed visited me daily, speaking not just of God but of dignity, of second chances. You've carried more than your share, Margaret, he told me. It's time others carried you for a while. There are housing programs, places where you'd have your own room, privacy, safety. It won't happen overnight, but we'll get you there. The thought of a place to call my own again, however small, stirred something in me. Not hope exactly, but the faint outline of it, like sunlight struggling through storm clouds. Still, nights were hard. I would wake in the dark, my body shivering from memories more than cold. I saw Daniel's face the night he turned me out, the broom clutched in his hand, the door closing as I begged silently for him to change his mind. Those images haunted me, and no amount of kindness could erase them. And yet, I wasn't alone anymore. Clara checked on me with bowls of soup, Eleanor with her steady presence, Pastor Reed with his quiet wisdom. The community, once distant, now circled around me like a quilt stitched from many hands. The storm outside raged for days, piling snow higher, closing schools, freezing pipes. But inside the church, surrounded by people who refused to let me vanish, I realized something important. I had lost a home, yes, but perhaps I was finding something greater proof that even when family fails you, humanity can still rise to catch you before you fall too far. I had always believed my son was a good man. Flawed, yes, who among us isn't? But good at his core. That belief was what made his betrayal so unbearable. After I was rescued from the snow and word spread about how close I came to dying, the silence from Daniel grew louder than any storm outside. What I didn't know then was that my son's silence was not born of indifference but of fear. Daniel lived only a few blocks from the church, yet he walked different streets, kept his head down when he passed neighbors. Whispers followed him like shadows. At the auto shop where he worked, his coworkers avoided his gaze. One man muttered, "Threw your own mother out in a blizzard?" And Daniel's fists tightened so hard his knuckles went white. He said nothing, but the words dug into him. At home, Lauren carried her own bitterness. "Why should we be the villains?" she snapped one night as she slammed a pot onto the stove. "People don't understand. We can barely pay rent ourselves. She was draining us, and..." Daniel rubbed his temples, exhaustion weighing him down. "She wasn't draining us, Lauren. She gave everything she had. You just didn't see it." Lauren froze, then turned sharply. "So now you're blaming me? You're the one who told her to leave." The truth cut deeper than either of them wanted to admit. Daniel had spoken the words, wielded the broom, turned the lock. He had chosen anger over patience, pride over love, and now the image of his mother lying in the snow haunted his every waking hour. One evening, after another tense day at the shop, Daniel found himself standing outside the church. The stained glass windows glowed faintly in the winter dusk, and voices drifted from inside hymns, soft laughter, the clinking of dishes being cleared after supper. He hesitated, his breath fogging in the air. Part of him wanted to walk away, to let the door remain closed. But another part, the part that still remembered his mother tucking him in at night, pushed him forward. Inside, he saw her. Margaret sat near the front, her frame thinner than he remembered, her hair pulled back neatly. Eleanor sat beside her, knitting as always, while Clara set bowls of soup on a long table. Pastor Reed spoke with a group of volunteers, his calm presence filling the room. Daniel's chest tightened. He had imagined this moment countless times, but facing it in reality was something else entirely. His mother's laughter, soft, fragile, reached his ears, and he almost broke then and there. But shame rooted his feet. He stayed at the back, hidden in the shadows, until Margaret turned her head slightly, as though sensing him. Their eyes met. For a split second, Daniel was a child again, caught doing something wrong, waiting for forgiveness he didn't deserve. But Margaret said nothing. Her gaze held no anger, only a quiet sadness. That silence was worse than any shouted rebuke. He left before anyone else noticed. The following days were no easier. Lauren grew frustrated with his distraction, snapping that he needed to man up and stop wallowing. But Daniel could not silence the guilt gnawing at him. He remembered his mother's sacrifices, the nights she stayed up sewing, the times she skipped meals so he could eat, the way she cheered at every baseball game even when he struck out. All those memories collided with the image of her shivering in the snow, and the contrast nearly broke him. Meanwhile, the community pressure mounted. Mrs. Brooks, never one to hold her tongue, confronted Daniel directly outside the corner store. "You may think people forget, Daniel Hayes," she said, her cane tapping firmly against the pavement. "But mothers don't come with replacements. You'll regret this long after the bills are paid." He lowered his eyes, muttering, "I know," but the words felt hollow even to him. One night, unable to bear the weight any longer, Daniel walked again to the church. This time he entered during a quiet hour, when most had gone home. Pastor Reed was tidying hymnals, his movements slow and deliberate. When he saw Daniel, he nodded calmly, as though expecting him. "Daniel," the pastor said. "I wondered when you'd come." Daniel swallowed hard. Is she all right?" "She's healing," Reed replied. "Body and spirit both take time, but she is safe." The relief nearly buckled Daniel's knees. He gripped the back of a pew, struggling for words. I never thought it would go that far. You let anger speak louder than love," Reed said gently, not as an accusation but as a truth laid bare. "It happens, but the question is, what will you do now?" Daniel pressed his palms against his face, his voice muffled. "I don't know if she'll ever forgive me." "Forgiveness," the pastor said, "isn't earned with words alone. It's shown through change, through choosing differently tomorrow than you did yesterday." The conversation lingered with Daniel long after he left. For the first time, he considered not just the damage done, but what it might take to repair it. Back at home, Lauren noticed his restlessness. "Don't tell me you're thinking of bringing her back," she said sharply. Daniel shook his head. "It's not about that. It's about making things right, somehow." Lauren's eyes narrowed. "And what about us? What about our bills, our future?" He sighed. "If I can't honor the woman who gave me life, then what kind of man am I? What kind of husband? What kind of father, if we ever have children?" For once, Lauren had no reply. She turned away, the silence between them thicker than the snow outside. In the days that followed, Daniel began helping quietly at the church. He repaired a broken furnace pipe in the basement, fixed squeaky doors, replaced light bulbs. He never asked for recognition. Sometimes he caught glimpses of his mother, though she rarely looked his way. The distance between them was wide, but he hoped, brick by brick, to build a bridge across it. When I was younger, I believed healing was a simple thing: rest a while, take medicine, and the body would mend. But as I lay in the church shelter, day after day, I learned that healing is never just about the body. It is the spirit that takes the longest to repair. The bruises on my hands faded, the cough in my chest eased, and warmth returned to my skin thanks to the quilts and hot meals that the volunteers provided. Yet inside, a coldness lingered, one that no blanket could chase away. It was the cold of betrayal, the kind that seeps deep into the heart. Each morning, Pastor Reed made rounds, offering a quiet word to every soul under his care. "Good morning, Margaret," he would say, his voice steady, like a lighthouse cutting through fog. "How are we today?" I always answered with a polite smile, but he could see beyond the surface. Sometimes he lingered, sharing small reflections about dignity, about strength found in community. His words planted seeds in soil I thought barren. Clara remained my anchor. She came after closing her diner, carrying little treats she thought I'd like: a slice of apple pie, a cup of hot cocoa. She talked about her late husband, how she had nearly lost herself in grief, but found purpose again by serving others. "Pain can make you bitter," she told me one night, "or it can make you softer, more open to the world. I chose softer. You can too." Eleanor visited often as well. She would sit knitting in silence beside me, occasionally humming hymns under her breath. Her presence was like a steady flame, quiet but unyielding. "You've survived worse than snow, Margaret," she said once. "Don't let one storm define your whole life." Still, there was Daniel. I saw him sometimes, moving about the church with tools in hand. At first, I thought it was coincidence, but soon I realized he was volunteering, helping fix whatever needed fixing. Pipes, doors, lights, he seemed determined to make himself useful. But he never approached me directly. We shared glances, brief and heavy, words trapped between us like birds against a window. One evening, Pastor Reed sat with me after supper. "There's a program," he said gently. "Housing for seniors, subsidized by the city. You'd have your own room, privacy, safety. I think you'd thrive there." The thought stunned me. A place of my own. 4 walls that were mine alone, not borrowed space, not a charity cot. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. "Wouldn't that mean leaving Daniel behind?" I asked, my voice trembling. Reed leaned forward. "Leaving doesn't always mean abandoning. Sometimes it means creating space for relationships to heal. Distance can protect love where closeness only causes harm." I turned his words over in my mind for days. I thought of my husband, how we had dreamed of growing old together in a little house with a garden. That dream had ended too soon, but maybe a smaller dream was still possible: a room of my own, a window with a view, neighbors who understood loneliness. One afternoon, as I sat with Eleanor, she asked bluntly, "Do you want to go back to him?" I hesitated. "He's my son. A mother's heart always wants to return." "But," she pressed. "But I'm afraid," I admitted. "Afraid he'll hurt me again. Afraid I'll be nothing more than a burden." Eleanor nodded slowly, her needles clicking. "Then choose dignity. Love him, yes, but don't lose yourself for his sake. We women spend our lives giving everything away. There comes a time when we must keep something for ourselves." Her words sank deep. That evening, Daniel approached me for the first time. He stood awkwardly at the end of my cot, his hands twisting together. "Mom," he began, his voice raw. I don't know how to say this." I looked at him, my heart both yearning and wary. "I was wrong," he said. "I was angry, scared. I let the pressure get to me, and I took it out on you. I can't take back what I did, but I need you to know I regret it every day." His eyes shone with unshed tears. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I want to make things right." Somehow, silence stretched between us. Finally, I whispered, "Do you know what it felt like? To be sent out into the snow by your own child?" He flinched. "I know, and it kills me." I wanted to reach for him, to pull him into my arms like I had when he was a boy. But I held back. Instead, I said softly, "Love without respect isn't love at all. If you want to make things right, learn to see me as more than a burden." His tears slipped free then. He nodded, unable to speak, and left me with my thoughts. That night, I dreamed of warmth not from the furnace of Daniel's house, but from a room filled with light, my own quilt on my own bed, a garden outside where flowers braved the snow. I woke with tears on my cheeks, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of longing for independence. The decision crystallized in the following days. I would move into the senior housing once a spot opened. It wasn't running from Daniel, nor was it punishing him. It was choosing myself, choosing dignity after a lifetime of sacrifice. When I told Clara and Eleanor, they both hugged me tightly. Pastor Reed smiled gently, as though he had known all along this would be my choice. But telling Daniel was another matter. His face fell when I explained. "So you're really leaving me," he whispered. "I'm not leaving you," I said firmly. "I'm finding myself again. You can still visit. We can still share meals. But I can't live in a place where I feel unwanted. This way, we both have room to heal." He nodded slowly. Pain etched on his face, but somewhere in his eyes I saw relief too. Perhaps he knew this was for the best. For the first time in months, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The storm outside still howled, but inside, a quiet strength had taken root. I was no longer just surviving, I was preparing to live again. The day I moved into the senior housing complex, the snow had finally eased. The sun broke through the gray clouds for the first time in weeks, casting a glittering sheen over the mountains of snow that lined the streets. It felt like a fragile light pushing back against the dark. Clara insisted on driving me, her old sedan creaking under the weight of years but still reliable. Eleanor rode in the back seat, clutching a box of quilts she had made for me. Pastor Reed met us at the entrance, his smile warm despite the biting wind. For once, I didn't feel like a burden being shifted from one place to another. I felt like a woman stepping into a new chapter, supported by friends who cared. The complex itself stood tall and brick, modest but welcoming. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon polish and fresh bread from the communal kitchen. The lobby bustled with activity residents chatting, staff moving with quiet efficiency, a bulletin board covered with flyers announcing bingo nights, knitting circles, and weekly movie showings. It wasn't grand, but it was alive. They led me to my room on the 3rd floor. The door opened to reveal a small but cozy space. A single bed, neatly made with a white coverlet, a dresser, a chair by the window that overlooked a courtyard blanketed in snow. There was even a tiny bookshelf, empty and waiting to be filled. I ran my fingers along the windowsill, the paint smooth beneath my touch. For the first time in years, I had a place that was mine. No one's shadow loomed over me. No whispered complaints about being a burden. Just quiet, just space. Eleanor set her quilts at the foot of the bed. "Every home needs color," she said, spreading one across the mattress. The bright patches of fabric reds, blues, yellows transformed the plain room into something vibrant. I smiled, tears pricking my eyes. Clara placed a small plant on the windowsill, its green leaves defiant against the winter outside. "Something to remind you that spring always comes," she said. I hugged them both tightly. "You've given me more than I could ever repay." You don't owe us a thing," Clara said firmly. "You deserve this." The first night in my new room was strange. I lay awake, listening to the hum of the radiator, the muffled sounds of laughter from down the hall. It wasn't silence, but it wasn't loneliness either. It was community. A chorus of lives woven together under one roof. The next morning, I ventured into the common room. A group of residents sat at a large table, playing cards and sipping coffee. They looked up as I entered, curiosity in their eyes. A woman with silver curls waved me over. "New neighbor?" she asked brightly. I nodded, suddenly shy. "Margaret Hayes." "Welcome, Margaret," she said, patting the seat beside her. "I'm Helen, this is George, and that's Anita." I sat, and before long, we were talking as though we had known each other for years. They asked about my life, and while I spared them the painful details, I shared enough for them to understand I was starting over. They nodded knowingly. Many of them had stories of their own, tales of loss, of estranged families, of resilience. I realized I wasn't alone in my wounds. This place was a patchwork of survivors, each carrying scars hidden beneath smiles. Days turned into weeks. I joined a knitting circle where laughter flowed as freely as yarn. I attended movie nights, sitting among rows of chairs as old classics flickered across the screen. I even tried my hand at bingo, though I never seemed to win. It didn't matter. What mattered was the warmth, the companionship, the sense of belonging. Yet, even in this new beginning, Daniel lingered in my thoughts. He visited once, standing awkwardly in my doorway with a bag of groceries. He looked around the room, his eyes softening at the sight of the quilts, the little plant, the photographs I had placed on the dresser. "This is nice," he said quietly. "It's home," I replied. He set the bag down and shuffled his feet. "I wanted to make sure you had what you needed." I studied him, the boy and the man overlapping in his features. "What I need," I said gently, "is to know you're finding your way too." He didn't answer right away, but when he left, I saw something in his eyes, not just guilt, but determination. Perhaps he was learning, just as I was, how to begin again. Spring crept slowly into Buffalo. Snow melted into streams that ran along the sidewalks, and the courtyard of the complex began to show patches of green. I planted small flowers in the communal garden, my hands sinking into the soil with a joy I hadn't felt in years. Each bud that pushed through the earth felt like proof that life goes on, even after the harshest winter. One evening, sitting in the garden with Helen and George, I realized something profound. I had thought my story was ending the night Daniel closed the door on me, but here I was, alive, surrounded by new friends, with laughter rising around me like birdsong. My story wasn't over. It had simply changed course. For the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. Life in the senior housing complex settled into a rhythm. Mornings began with the sound of chatter in the dining hall, the clink of silverware against plates, and the smell of fresh coffee brewing. Afternoons were filled with activities, card games, knitting, movie matinees. Evenings brought quiet, the glow of lamps through hallway windows, and neighbors saying goodnight with gentle smiles. At first, I drifted through these routines like a guest unsure of her place. But slowly, I began to weave myself into the fabric of the community. Helen, with her silver curls and quick wit, became my closest friend. She had raised 4 children on her own after her husband passed, only to watch most of them scatter across the country. "They call on holidays," she said with a shrug, "but holidays don't keep you warm in February." She laughed as she said it, but I heard the ache beneath. She filled her days with bridge games and knitting, claiming she preferred the company of yarn and cards to long-distance phone calls. George was a retired firefighter. Tall and broad, even in his 80s, his wife had died a decade ago, and though he spoke of her often, he carried his grief with grace. "Every scar has a story," he told me once, showing me the burn mark on his arm from a rescue years back. "The trick is learning how to tell the story without letting it consume you." Anita, quiet but thoughtful, shared her poetry during the weekly reading circle. Her verses spoke of rivers and seasons, but I recognized the undercurrent of loneliness. She told me she had never married, choosing instead to care for her parents until their passing. "I don't regret it," she said softly. "But sometimes, when the nights are long, I wonder what might have been." Listening to their stories, I realized we were all travelers on the same road, carrying burdens we rarely shared with the outside world. There was comfort in that, a sense of belonging I hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, Helen and I sat in the garden, our hands buried in soil as we planted marigolds. The sun was warm on our backs, a rare gift in Buffalo's early spring. She glanced at me and said, You're quieter these days. What's on your mind? I hesitated. Daniel, I admitted. Her hands stilled. The son who… Yes. I pressed the soil down firmly. I can't seem to stop thinking about him, about what he did, but also about why. I know the world is hard. I know money is tight, and pride makes people cruel. But sometimes I wonder, did I fail him somehow? Did I not raise him to carry kindness when the world pressed down? Helen looked at me for a long moment. Margaret, children make their own choices. You can pour love into them every single day, and still, when life tests them, they stumble. That's not your failure. That's just being human. Her words loosened a knot inside me. I thought of the sacrifices I had made sewing late into the night, selling my ring, skipping meals. Perhaps I had been too harsh on myself, believing I could shape every part of Daniel's character. Perhaps motherhood wasn't about perfect outcomes, but about love freely given, no matter the result. Later that week, during the poetry circle, Anita read a piece about forgiveness. Her voice trembled, but grew steadier with each line. Forgiveness, she read, is not a gift for the one who wronged us. It is a key we give ourselves to open the cage of bitterness. The words struck deep. I realized I had been carrying bitterness like a stone in my pocket, heavy and constant. Daniel's betrayal had defined my nights, coloring even my dreams. What if letting go wasn't about excusing him, but about freeing myself? That night, I sat by my window, looking out at the courtyard lit by soft lamps. Snow still lingered in patches, though green shoots pushed stubbornly through. I opened my Bible, the same one I had carried through every storm, and let my fingers rest on the pages. My husband's voice seemed to echo in my heart. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. I whispered into the quiet, I forgive you, Daniel. Tears blurred my vision, but for the first time, they felt like release, not despair. The next morning, I joined a group walk around the block, a small exercise program organized by the staff. As we moved slowly, bundled against the lingering chill, I realized how different I felt. Lighter somehow. The burden I had carried for months no longer pressed so sharply against my chest. In the days that followed, I grew closer to my new friends. George taught me how to play poker, laughing when I accused him of bluffing. Helen and I began baking pies together in the communal kitchen, sharing them with whoever stopped by. Anita asked me to share one of my own stories during the poetry circle, and though my voice shook, I told them about the night Daniel was born, the way his tiny hand wrapped around my finger, the fierce rush of love that had filled me. When I finished, the room was silent, eyes glistening. For the first time, I realized my story still mattered. Daniel continued to visit, though infrequently. Each time, he seemed a little softer, a little more willing to listen. Once, he brought Lauren, who stood stiffly at first but eventually joined us for coffee. She didn't say much, but her eyes held a flicker of something, perhaps regret, perhaps uncertainty. It was enough. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the buildings and the courtyard filled with golden light, I sat surrounded by my new friends. Helen told a joke that made us all laugh. George recounted a daring rescue from his firefighting days, and Anita read another poem. I looked around at their faces, lined with age but glowing with life, and I realized something profound. Family isn't always bound by blood. Sometimes, family is the people who sit beside you when the world has cast you aside, who remind you that your story is still unfolding, that your worth hasn't expired. And in that moment, I knew I had not just found shelter. I had found home. Daniel had never been a man of many words. When he was younger, he let his fists and stubborn jaw do the talking, whether on the baseball field or in arguments with neighborhood boys. As an adult, silence had become his armor. But silence has a way of growing heavy, and in the months after I moved into the senior housing complex, it nearly crushed him. At home, the atmosphere with Lauren grew tense. She worked long shifts at the grocery store, her patience worn thin by demanding customers and rising prices. Daniel came home tired from the auto shop, hands blackened by grease, shoulders slumped. They spoke less and less, their conversations clipped, their dinners eaten in silence except for the clatter of forks. One evening, as snow tapped against the windows, Lauren finally broke the quiet. "I saw Mrs. Brooks today," she said, her tone sharp. She looked at me like I was trash. Do you know what people are saying about us? That we threw your mother out to die in the snow. Daniel's fork froze halfway to his mouth. He set it down carefully, his jaw tightening. We did, he said quietly. Lauren glared at him. We had no choice. We couldn't afford her. She was draining us, Daniel. Everyone's struggling. Why should we be the ones to carry the weight? He leaned back, rubbing his temples. She carried me. For years. She carried both of us. And when she needed me, I pushed her out. You're exaggerating, Lauren snapped, though her voice wavered. She's fine now. The church is taking care of her. She has that little apartment or whatever. Why dig up the past? Because the past isn't buried, Daniel shot back. I see it every time I close my eyes. Her face that night, the snow, the way she looked at me. That doesn't just disappear. Lauren slammed her glass down, water splashing onto the table. So what, you want to bring her back here? Let her live with us again? Because I won't do it. Daniel stared at her, his chest tight. It's not about dragging her back here. It's about who I am. What kind of man throws his mother into a storm? What kind of husband can I be if I can't even own up to what I've done? The room went silent, their breaths harsh in the stillness. Over the next weeks, the cracks in their marriage deepened. Daniel spent more time at the church, repairing things, sometimes sitting in the back during services, listening to Pastor Reed's sermons about forgiveness and redemption. He rarely spoke, but each word sank into him like water into dry earth. Lauren noticed the change. You're different, she said one night as he came home late. Quieter, distant. I'm trying to figure things out, Daniel admitted. Figure what out? She demanded. Whether I can keep living like this, he said, his voice steady. Pretending it doesn't matter. Pretending what we did doesn't matter. Lauren's face hardened. If you walk down that road, Daniel, don't expect me to follow. Her words lingered, sharp as broken glass. Meanwhile, Daniel began visiting me more often. At first, he brought groceries or small repairs for my room, a new light bulb, a tightened chair leg. But soon he stayed longer, sitting across from me in the common room, listening as I told stories of my new friends. He never interrupted, never rushed, just sat with me. One evening, as the sun dipped low, he finally spoke what had weighed on him. Mom, I don't know if you'll ever believe me, but I'm trying. I can't erase what I did, but I don't want it to be the last chapter of us. I studied him, the lines of regret etched deep into his face. Change takes more than words, Daniel, I said gently. But I see the effort. That matters. Lauren came with him once, reluctantly. She sat stiffly in the chair, arms crossed. Helen and George greeted her warmly, but she offered only polite nods. When Clara stopped by with pie, Lauren declined a slice, saying she wasn't hungry. The tension was thick, but I saw something flicker in her eyes as she glanced around the room, at the laughter, at the way my friends treated me with respect. Perhaps she realized I wasn't the helpless burden she had painted me to be. Afterward, in the car, she turned to Daniel. She looks happy, she said, almost surprised. She is, Daniel replied, happier than she was with us. Lauren's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't answer, but she didn't argue either. That night, Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He thought of the vows he had spoken to Lauren, the life they had built together, fragile though it was. He thought of me, my fragile body bundled in coats, my laughter in the common room, my tears when I forgave him. And he knew he stood at a crossroads. He could keep hiding behind excuses, let bitterness erode his marriage, his conscience, his soul. Or he could face the truth fully, risk the fractures, and become the man he wanted to be, the man I had raised him to be. The choice was his, and it weighed heavier than any snowstorm. The senior housing complex had become more than just a place to live. By spring, it was a living, breathing community, and to my surprise, I had become part of its heartbeat. It began subtly. One evening, Helen asked me to lead the knitting circle because her arthritis was acting up. I hesitated, unsure if my voice carried enough authority, but the women looked at me expectantly. So I guided them through a new pattern, clumsy at first, then steadier. Laughter filled the room as we untangled knots and teased one another. When the session ended, Helen patted my hand. You're a natural leader, Margaret. Don't pretend otherwise. Soon, others began seeking me out. George asked me to join the Residents' Council, a small group that met monthly with staff to discuss needs and concerns. Anita asked if I would read one of her poems aloud, because her voice often quavered under pressure. Even new residents gravitated toward me, perhaps sensing the quiet resilience I didn't know I carried. One afternoon, a woman named Ruth moved in. She was thin as a reed, her eyes wary. I recognized the look someone who had lost much, someone bracing for disappointment. I invited her to sit with us at lunch. She barely touched her food, but when I told a story about Daniel as a mischievous boy, her lips twitched into the faintest smile. Later, she whispered to me, "It helps. Hearing someone else's struggles makes me feel less alone." That night, as I lay in bed, I realized something had shifted. For months, I had thought of myself as the one in need, the one rescued from the storm. But now, I was offering shelter not with walls or roofs, but with presence, with listening, with shared laughter. I had become part of the quilt of this place, a patch that gave warmth to others. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his visits. They grew more frequent, less tentative. Sometimes he brought small repairs. Sometimes he brought nothing at all but himself. He would sit in the courtyard with me, watching birds peck at crumbs on the path. One afternoon, as we sat in the sunshine, he said quietly, "Mom, I started going to meetings at work. They're trying to organize for better pay, fewer cut hours. I'm actually speaking up." I smiled. "That's good, Daniel. You have a voice. Use it." "After." He looked at me, almost boyish again. I think I'm finally learning what it means to stand up, instead of just lashing out." It was a small confession, but it meant the world. Lauren, too, began to soften, though she rarely visited. Once, she sent me a basket of muffins with a short note. "Thank you for being patient with us." I could tell the words had cost her something, and I tucked the note into my Bible, a reminder that even the hardest hearts can thaw. In May, the complex held its annual spring festival. The courtyard bloomed with tulips and daffodils, tables laden with food, music drifting through open windows. Children from a nearby school performed songs, their voices bright against the blue sky. I helped organize a bake sale, and to my astonishment, my apple pie sold out first. "Margaret's pies are famous now," George teased, and I laughed, cheeks flushed with pride. During the festival, Daniel showed up unexpectedly. He mingled awkwardly at first, but soon found himself repairing a jammed door on one of the storage sheds, surrounded by grateful residents. Watching him work, sweat on his brow, I felt a surge of something I hadn't, in months, hope. Later, he found me by the garden. "You look happy here," he said, almost wistful. "I am," I admitted. "But happiness doesn't mean I don't miss you. It means I found a way to live, even with the missing." His eyes filled, and for once, he didn't look away. "I want to do better, Mom. For you. For me. For Lauren, too." I reached for his hand. "Then keep walking this road. Don't stop halfway." That night, as lanterns glowed in the courtyard and music floated on the breeze, I felt a deep peace. My life hadn't followed the path I once imagined, but perhaps it had led me exactly where I needed to be. For in this place, surrounded by friends who had become family, and with a son slowly finding his way back, I had not only survived the storm, I had grown stronger because of it. The senior housing complex had grown into more than just shelter. It was a tapestry of fragile lives woven together. Yet even the strongest fabric can fray when tested. That test came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, when the air smelled of rain and the clouds hung heavy over Buffalo. I was in the common room with Helen, knitting as we always did, when a sudden commotion broke out in the hallway. Voices rose, frantic and sharp. I stood quickly, my heart pounding, and hurried toward the noise. There, in the corridor, I saw George, the retired firefighter, strong as an oak despite his years collapsed on the floor. His face was pale, his breathing ragged. Residents gathered around, their voices overlapping in panic. "Call an ambulance," someone shouted. "I already did," another cried, fumbling with her phone. But in that moment, fear was stronger than reason. People froze, hands shaking, unsure what to do. Without thinking, I knelt beside George. Memories surged my husband's illness. nights spent by his bedside, the calm I had forced myself to carry for Daniel's sake. I reached for George's hand, squeezing it firmly. "Stay with me, George," I said, my voice steady, though my chest trembled. "Help is coming. You're not alone." End quote. His eyes fluttered, the strength in them dim but present. I kept speaking, murmuring words of comfort, my hand never leaving his. Around us, residents shifted from panic to stillness, drawn into the calm like moths to flame. When the paramedics arrived minutes later, they found George stable enough to move. As they lifted him onto the stretcher, he looked at me and whispered, "Thank you." After they left, the hallway buzzed with anxious energy. Residents turned to me, their faces pale. What if it happens again? What if we're not enough? The fear was contagious, spreading faster than any illness. I straightened, my knees aching but my voice firm. "Listen to me," I said, louder than I thought possible. "We are stronger together than we are apart." Today, George needed calm, and we gave it to him. Tomorrow, it could be any of us. But if we look out for one another, if we don't give in to fear, we'll be all right. Silence followed, heavy but hopeful. Slowly, nods rippled through the crowd. A sense of unity, fragile but real, took root. Later that evening, after the building quieted, I sat in the garden, exhaustion weighing on me. That's when I noticed Daniel standing by the gate. He must have arrived during the chaos. His eyes searched mine, wide with something I hadn't seen in years, pride. "I saw what you did," he said softly, approaching. "The way you calmed everyone. Mom, you were like a rock." I laughed weakly. "A rock with creaky knees." He shook his head. "Number stronger than anyone I know. All this time I thought I had to protect you, but maybe I had it backward." His words pierced me deeper than he knew. For months, I had carried the sting of rejection, the ache of being cast out. Now, hearing my son recognize my strength felt like a healing balm. "Daniel," I said gently, "strength isn't about never falling. It's about standing back up. You'll learn that too." And we sat in silence then, the night settling around us. For the first time, there was no wall between us, only the quiet bond of shared understanding. The next day, word came that George would recover. Relief swept through the complex, laughter returning to the halls. Residents sought me out, thanking me, calling me brave. I smiled, but inside, I knew bravery wasn't mine alone. It was born of every storm I had endured, every sacrifice, every scar. That evening, Daniel visited again, this time with Lauren by his side. She looked uneasy, as if unsure she belonged. But when residents greeted me warmly, when Helen clasped my hand and called me our Margaret, I saw something shift in Lauren's eyes. Perhaps she realized I wasn't the burden she had once claimed, but a pillar standing firm in the storm. For the first time, I felt truly seen, not as a castaway, not as a burden, but as a woman who had weathered life and come out stronger. And Daniel, watching quietly beside me, seemed to see it too. When George returned from the hospital, the whole complex celebrated with a potluck in the common room. Laughter filled the halls again, the fear of that day fading into memory. I should have felt nothing but joy, but part of my heart lingered elsewhere on Daniel and Lauren. Though Daniel visited more often, I noticed the heaviness in his eyes. His smiles were fleeting, his words cautious. One evening, as we sat in the courtyard watching the first fireflies of summer, I asked gently, "How are things at home?" He hesitated before answering. "Not good. We argue more than we talk. Lauren says I've changed, and maybe she's right. I can't unsee what happened, Mom. I can't unfeel it." I reached for his hand. "Change isn't the enemy, Daniel. Sometimes it's the only way forward." He nodded, but his expression told me he didn't know if Lauren felt the same. Meanwhile, Lauren stayed away. The few times she joined Daniel, she kept her distance, her arms folded, her smile forced. I didn't press her. I had learned long ago that people open their hearts in their own time, or not at all. One humid July evening, the storm came not of snow this time, but of words. Daniel later told me how it unfolded. They had just finished dinner, a silent meal eaten in the dim light of their small kitchen. Lauren pushed her plate away with a sigh. "We can't keep living like this, Daniel. The bills pile up, the hours at work keep getting cut, And you spend all your free time at that church or with your mother. Daniel set his fork down carefully. I'm trying to make things right. With her, with myself. And what about me? Lauren snapped. Do I even matter anymore? Or is everything just about making up for what you did? Her words stung, but Daniel didn't lash out as he once would have. Instead, he leaned back, his voice steady. You do matter, more than you know. But I can't ignore the truth anymore. Pretending we were justified that night nearly destroyed me. If I keep living in that lie, we'll both drown. Lauren's eyes flashed. So this is my fault? No, he said quietly. It's mine, but I can choose differently now. And so can you. The fight ended not with slamming doors, but with silence, heavy and sharp. For the first time, Lauren realized Daniel wasn't going to bury the past to make life easier. He was determined to face it, even if it meant risking their marriage. Days later, Lauren came to see me. She stood in my doorway, awkward, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for escape. I invited her in, offering tea. She sat stiffly, hands clasped tight. I don't know why I'm here, she admitted. Maybe you do, I said gently. She sighed, her voice breaking. I keep thinking about that night. I told myself it was the only choice, that we couldn't afford you. But when I saw you at the festival, laughing, alive, I realized we threw you out not because we had to, but because we were afraid. Afraid of failing, afraid of losing control. And instead of facing that, we put it on you. Tears filled her eyes. I don't know how to live with that. I reached across the table, placing my hand over hers. You live with it by changing. Fear makes us cruel. But love gives us the courage to admit we were wrong. And Lauren bowed her head, her shoulders shaking. For the first time, I saw not the sharp-tongued daughter-in-law, but a woman weighed down by guilt, by her own storms. That evening, Daniel returned alone. She cried after she left your room, he told me, but she said it felt like a weight lifted. I smiled faintly. Sometimes, Daniel, healing doesn't come from fighting harder. It comes from softening. The weeks that followed were not easy for them. They argued still, but the arguments shifted. Less about blame, more about fear, about dreams deferred, about the kind of life they wanted to build. Daniel began inviting Lauren to join him at the church, not for sermons, but for community dinners, where laughter and warmth softened the edges of their bitterness. One evening, as they left, I watched from the courtyard. Lauren slipped her hand into Daniel's, hesitant, but real. It was a small gesture, but it spoke louder than words. For the first time, I believed they might weather their storm together. As for me, I continued to find purpose within the complex. Residents looked to me not just as a friend, but as a steady presence. When fears arose, when loneliness crept in, I was there with a story, with a prayer, with the quiet assurance that storms do pass. And though I no longer lived under Daniel's roof, I realized I was shaping his home, still not by my presence, but by the example of resilience, forgiveness, and love. It was a warm August morning when the trouble began. The air in Buffalo had grown heavy with humidity, and even the walls of the senior housing complex seemed to sweat. I had been busy helping Helen with preparations for the weekly bingo night, carrying boxes of supplies from the storage room to the common area. By the third trip, I felt lightheaded, but I brushed it aside. I'm just tired, I told myself. Nothing a cup of water won't fix. But as I bent to pick up another box, the room tilted sharply. A rush of heat swept through me, and before I could steady myself, darkness claimed my vision. When I awoke, I was lying in my bed, the hum of the air conditioner filling the silence. Helen sat at my side, worry etched across her face. You fainted, Margaret. Scared us half to death. The nurse is on her way. I tried to sit up, but she pressed me back gently. Rest. Let someone else carry the boxes for once. Later, the nurse confirmed it was dehydration and exhaustion. Nothing life-threatening, but I was shaken all the same. My body had always been resilient, but age was catching up, reminding me that even the strongest spirit lives in fragile flesh. Word of my collapse spread quickly. By evening, my small room was crowded with visitors, Clara with soup, Anita with a poem she insisted would bring healing, George with a stern lecture about pacing myself. Their care warmed me, but it also stirred old fears. Would I become a burden again, even here? The next day, a knock sounded at my door. When I opened it, Daniel and Lauren stood there, both looking uneasy. Daniel held a bag of groceries, Lauren a bouquet of flowers. "We heard," Daniel said, his voice thick. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I assured them. "Just a spell. The nurse says I need more rest." Lauren stepped forward hesitantly. "We wanted to help, if you'll let us." Her tone was softer than I had ever heard. She set the flowers in a vase on my dresser, adjusting them carefully. Daniel unpacked the groceries, lining up fruit, bread, and milk in my small fridge. They moved around the room with a quiet determination, as if making amends not with words but with hands. For the next week, they visited daily. Daniel fixed the squeaky hinge on my dresser and replaced a burned-out bulb. Lauren cooked simple meals in the communal kitchen, carrying them to my room with a smile that grew less forced each day. Sometimes they sat with me, just talking about their work, their struggles, even their hopes for the future. One evening, as the sun set golden over the courtyard, I said softly, "You don't have to do all this. I'm not helpless." Daniel looked at me, his expression firm. "We know, but we want to. We need to." Lauren added, her eyes glistening. "It's not pity, Margaret. It's gratitude for your patience, for your forgiveness, for showing us how to be better." Tears blurred my vision. For so long, I had carried the weight of being cast out, of feeling unwanted. Now, in this small room filled with flowers and food and love, I felt the burden lift. The community noticed, too. "Your son's been around a lot," Helen remarked with a grin. "He even fixed the lock on the laundry room door." I nodded, pride swelling in my chest. "He's learning." The weeks passed, and my strength returned. By September, I was back in the garden, planting mums with Eleanor and laughing as George teased us about our green thumbs. But something inside me had shifted. The scare had reminded me of life's fragility. Yes, but it had also revealed something deeper, that love, once thought lost, could be reborn. One Sunday, Daniel and Lauren joined me for the community dinner at the church. They sat at my table, sharing bread and conversation with my friends. Clara leaned over to me and whispered, "Looks like your family's finding its way back together." I smiled. "Yes," I whispered back, "in their own time." "Oh." As the evening ended, Daniel helped me to my feet, his arms steady under mine. For the first time in a long while, I felt not like a burden, but like a mother cherished. By the time autumn settled over Buffalo, the leaves had turned shades of crimson and gold, carpeting the sidewalks in color. The senior housing complex buzzed with energy as residents prepared for the annual harvest celebration, a tradition of music, food, and gratitude, before the long winter set in. This year, the staff insisted on adding something new, honoring one resident whose spirit had lifted the community. I never imagined that resident would be me. When Pastor Reed arrived one afternoon to deliver the news, I nearly dropped the basket of apples I had been peeling. "Margaret," he said, his eyes twinkling, "the Residents' Council unanimously chose you. They want to recognize the strength you've shown, not just in your own journey, but in the way you've held others together." "Oh." I shook my head in disbelief. "I'm no hero, Pastor. I just survived." He smiled gently. "Sometimes surviving is the greatest act of courage." The evening of the celebration, the common room was transformed. Strings of orange and yellow lights draped along the walls, tables laden with pies, casseroles, and steaming pots of soup. Residents gathered with laughter, their voices rising above the hum of a violin played by a local student. The air smelled of cinnamon and roasted squash. Helen sat proudly at my side, her silver curls crowned with a paper wreath she had made for the occasion. George, strong and steady once again, carried trays of food with the gusto of a man half his age. Anita recited a poem she had written about resilience, her words floating through the room like autumn leaves. Then Pastor Reed stepped to the front, raising his hand for silence. "Tonight," he said, "we give thanks not only for the harvest of the earth, but for the harvest of spirit, the way we grow stronger when we stand together. And this year, we honor a woman whose journey reminds us all that storms do not define us. Please join me in celebrating Margaret Hayes." Applause thundered through the room. My cheeks burned as I rose, my knees trembling. I glanced around and saw faces glowing with pride. friends who had become family, and then, in the back of the room, I saw Daniel and Lauren, their hands clasped together. Tears filled my eyes. I stepped to the front, my voice shaking at first, but gaining strength. "I don't know how to thank you," I began. "When I came here, I thought my story was ending. I was broken, cast out, and afraid. But this community gave me something I thought I had lost forever, a sense of belonging. You reminded me that even in the harshest winters there is warmth to be found in kindness. And you taught me that family isn't only the people we're born to, but the people who choose to stand beside us." The room fell silent, the weight of my words settling over us. I turned toward Daniel and Lauren, meeting their eyes. "And to my son, and to the woman who is part of his heart, I want you to know that forgiveness is not about forgetting. It's about choosing love over bitterness. I choose love. Always." Daniel's face crumpled, his shoulders shaking as he fought back tears. Lauren pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes glistening. Afterward, as music resumed and the feast began, Daniel approached me. He pulled me into an embrace so tight it stole my breath. "Mom," he whispered, "I don't deserve you." I cupped his face in my hands, seeing not the man who had failed me, but the boy I had raised, the man who was learning still. "None of us deserve grace, Daniel. That's why it's called a gift." Lauren joined us then, slipping her hand into mine. "Thank you," she said softly, "for giving us another chance." In that moment, surrounded by friends and family, I felt whole again. Not because the past had been erased, it never could be, but because love had triumphed over the storm. Later that night, as lanterns flickered in the courtyard and laughter drifted through open windows, I sat quietly, watching leaves fall in the golden glow. Life had not gone as I once dreamed, but perhaps it had given me something even greater. Proof that resilience can rebuild what storms try to destroy, and that forgiveness can heal even the deepest wounds. As autumn gave way to winter again, I often found myself sitting by the window of my little room, watching the first snowflakes drift from the sky. A year had nearly passed since the night I was cast into the storm, and yet it felt like a lifetime ago. The scars of that night would never vanish entirely. Sometimes, when the wind howled against the glass, I still remembered the sting of snow on my face, the ache of being unwanted. But now, those memories no longer crushed me. They had become reminders of what I had endured, of what I had overcome, and of how far I had come since then. Life in the senior housing complex moved with a gentle rhythm. The mornings were filled with laughter in the dining hall, afternoons with games and knitting circles, evenings with stories and prayers. My friends became my chosen family, Helen with her jokes, George with his wisdom, Anita with her poetry. Together, we built a community of resilience, one that proved none of us were alone, no matter what storms we had weathered. And Daniel, my son, had changed. Slowly, painfully, but genuinely. He no longer came weighed down by guilt alone. He came with joy, with conversation, with hope. He brought Lauren, too, and though her smiles were shy at first, they grew warmer each time. They helped in the garden, shared meals with my neighbors, listened to the stories that stitched our lives together. I knew our bond would never return to what it once was, but perhaps that was for the best. Love isn't about recreating the past, it's about building something new from what remains. One snowy evening, Daniel and I sat together in the courtyard, bundled in coats, watching the lights glow against the white drifts. "Mom," he said softly, "I used to think strength meant never needing anyone. But you've shown me it's the opposite. Strength is letting people in, even when it's hard." I smiled, my heart full. "Then you've learned what took me 70 years to discover." He laughed quietly, and for a moment, we simply sat together, no words needed. As I look back now, I see a story, not of tragedy, but of transformation. Yes, I was cast out into the storm, but I was also carried back into the warmth of community. Yes, my son failed me, but he also found his way back to love. And yes, I nearly lost everything, but in that loss, I discovered a new life, richer in ways I had never imagined. To anyone listening to my story, I want to say this. Storms will come. They always do. They will test you, strip you bare, make you believe you cannot go on. But storms do not have the final word. What defines us is how we rise after they pass, how we forgive, how we rebuild, how we love again. I am Margaret Hayes, a mother, a friend, a survivor. My journey is not over, but if it ends tomorrow, I will end it knowing I lived with resilience, and that in the harshest winter, I found warmth in the hearts of others. And that, I believe, is the true harvest of life. What did you feel while listening to this story all the way through? If it touched your heart, leave the number 1 inch the comments. If you didn't feel connected to it, feel free to write 0. Every piece of feedback means a lot to me, because it's thanks to you that I can keep going. It's from your responses that I draw the energy to tell the next chapter a new story is coming, even deeper, even more moving, and I truly hope you'll be there to listen with me.